Good evening, truth seekers. Tonight, we descend into one of the darkest chapters in human history. A story so horrific that it was buried for decades by governments who valued scientific data over justice. Between 1936 and 1945, in the frozen plains of Manchuria, the Imperial Japanese Army operated a secret facility where thousands were subjected to experiments so sadistic that even hardened investigators struggled to document them. They called it the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, but its real name was Unit 731, and it was a factory built to turn human beings into test subjects for biological warfare. This is the story of Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii and the atrocities committed in the name of science. The man behind the madness. Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 into a wealthy family in rural Japan. He was brilliant, arrogant, and utterly devoid of empathy. After graduating from Kyoto Imperial University in 1920, he joined the Army Medical Corps and quickly climbed the ranks. In 1925, the Geneva Protocol banned the use of biological and chemical weapons in warfare. Most nations saw this as a moral victory. Ishii saw it as an opportunity. He reasoned that if the world's powers were afraid enough to ban these weapons, they must be devastatingly effective. Ishii spent years traveling through Europe and the United States, studying bacteriological research. When he returned to Japan, he began lobbying the military to establish a bioweapons program. He argued that Japan needed these weapons to compete with Western powers. In 1932, his persistence paid off. The Japanese government authorized the creation of a covert biological warfare unit. Ishii was placed in command. Its first facility, the Jiangma Fortress in Beiyan, China, was operational by 1933, but Ishii had grander ambitions. In 1936, construction began on a massive complex in the Pingfang district near Harbin, Manchuria. This would become Unit 731. The complex of horror, when completed in 1940, Unit 731 was a sprawling campus of 150 buildings spread across 6 square kilometers. It housed laboratories, operating rooms, barracks, crematoria, and prison cells designed to hold up to 600 test subjects at any given time. The facility employed over 3,000 personnel, including doctors, scientists, technicians, canine, and military guards. It operated under the cover of disease prevention research, but its true purpose was far darker. The prisoners, mostly Chinese civilians, along with Russian, Korean, and Mongolian captives, were referred to as Marudis logs. This dehumanizing term reflected how Ishii's staff viewed their victims as raw materials to be used and discarded. Prisoners were kidnapped from the streets by the Kempeitai, Japan's brutal military police. Black vans, called ravens, would sweep through towns and villages, snatching people, men, women, even children, and delivering them to Unit 731's gates. Once inside, they were given 3-digit numbers to replace their names. They were cataloged, tested for baseline health metrics, and then assigned to various experimental programs. There were no trials, no sentences, no hope of escape. What followed was a systematic campaign of torture disguised as science. The experiments, a catalog of atrocities. The range of experiments conducted at Unit 731 defies comprehension. They were not designed to advance medicine or save lives. They were designed to test the limits of human suffering and develop weapons of mass destruction. It's biological weapons testing. The core mission was to weaponize disease. Its prisoners were deliberately infected with bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, smallpox, botulism, and more. Researchers monitored how the diseases spread, documenting every stage until death. Ishii wanted to know how to deliver these diseases as weapons. Its prisoners were tied to stakes in fields and subjected to bombs filled with plague, infected fleas, or anthrax spores. The effectiveness was measured by how many became infected and how quickly they died. Entire villages were used as test sites. Japanese planes would drop bombs or release contaminated food and water. Researchers would return days later to count the dead. Vivisection without anesthesia is one of the most horrific practices at Unit 731 was vivisection, the dissection of living human beings. Ishii believed that using anesthesia would alter the body's responses and compromise the data. So prisoners were cut open while fully conscious and aware. Organs were removed. Blood vessels were observed in real time. Limbs were amputated to study blood loss in shock. Pregnant women were vivisected to examine how diseases affected fetuses at different stages of development. The screams echoed through the facility. But for Ishii and his team, this was simply science. Frostbite experiments. Dr. Yoshimura Hasato, a physiologist at Unit 731, had a particular interest in frostbite. Japanese troops fighting in Manchuria's brutal winters suffered from cold-related injuries, and the military wanted solutions. Sato's method was simple and cruel. Prisoners were taken outside in freezing temperatures, sometimes as low as -20 degrees Celsius. Their arms or legs were submerged in tubs of ice water and held there until the limbs froze solid. Witnesses later described how the frozen limbs, when struck with a cane, made a sound like a plank of wood. Hisato would then test various methods of thawing, some involving boiling water, others gradual warming, to see which approach caused the most or least damage. Victims often died from shock or infection. Those who survived were subjected to further experiments. Pressure and centrifuge testing. Prisoners were locked into high-pressure chambers until eyeballs popped out of their sockets, or placed in centrifuges and spun at lethal speeds. The goal was to study extreme atmospheric changes in GI forces on the human body. Blood drainage. Researchers would drain massive quantities of blood from prisoners, 500 cubic centimeters or more, every 2 to 3 days, continuing until the victims were so debilitated they could no longer function. When the subjects could no longer serve as useful data sources, they were either killed or used in other experiments. Rape and forced pregnancy. Women were subjected to sexual violence as part of disease transmission studies. Male prisoners infected with syphilis were ordered to rape female prisoners to observe disease spread. Women were forcibly impregnated, then infected with diseases to study effects on mother and fetus. Some were vivisected while pregnant so researchers could examine fetal development in real time. Weapon testing. Prisoners were tied to stakes and subjected to flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonet practice. Researchers measured blast radii, burn severity, and penetration wounds with clinical detachment. Poison and gas experiments. Unit 731 tested chemical agents on prisoners. Victims were injected with cyanide, arsenic, and other toxins to establish lethal dosages. Others were locked in gas chambers and exposed to phosgene and chemical weapons. Every reaction was documented. Every death was analyzed. The body count. Historians believe that at least 3,000 to 12,000 people died directly from experiments at Unit 731's main facility. When accounting for field tests, contaminated villages, and related units across China and Southeast Asia, the total death toll may exceed 200,000 to 300,000. Unit 731 was not alone. It was the flagship of the network, including Unit 100, Unit 1644, and at least a dozen other branches. Together, they formed what historian Sheldon Harris called factories of death. The cover-up and the devil's bargain. In August 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria, Key ordered the destruction of Unit 731. Buildings were burned, prisoners were executed, documents were incinerated. Key attempted to fake his own death. The Soviets captured some personnel and in 1949 held the Khabarovsk war crimes trials, convicting 12 members with sentences of 2 to 25 years. The United States took a different approach. American forces tracked down Ishii and other key researchers. Instead of prosecuting them, the U.S. offered immunity in exchange for their data. In a 1947 memo, MacArthur wrote that the information was absolutely invaluable and could never have been obtained in the United States because of scruples attached to experiments on humans. The deal was struck. Ishii and his team handed over their research. In return, they walked free. No trials, no convictions, no justice. Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959 at age 67. Many colleagues went on to prominent careers as university presidents and medical leaders. One even headed the Japanese Olympic Committee. The victims received no such luxury. Most died in agony. Their names were erased. Their families never knew what happened. The legacy of silence. For decades, the Japanese government denied Unit 731 had ever existed. It wasn't until the 1980s that Japan began acknowledging the atrocities. In 1982, China opened a museum at the Harbin site. In 2002, a Japanese court finally ruled that Japan had engaged in biological warfare, but the full truth remains buried. Many documents were destroyed. Key details were never recorded. Those who participated took their secrets to the grave. The questions that remained. Nearly 80 years later, Unit 731's legacy haunts us. How could trained physicians commit such atrocities? How did scientists rationalize torture and murder in the name of progress? And most troubling, what does it say about justice when governments choose data over accountability? The United States deemed the information too valuable to prosecute. They chose scientific advantage over moral responsibility. The data turned out to be largely useless. Vivisecting human beings did not yield better scientific conclusions, but the precedent was set, and the victims were forgotten. Unit 731 reminds us that the greatest evil is not always committed by madmen. Sometimes it's committed by intelligent, educated people who convince themselves that the ends justify the means. Good night, truth seekers. Stay vigilant. Because history doesn't just teach us what happened, it warns us what could happen again. If you're enjoying the video so far, subscribe and follow Mystery and Madness for more deep dives into the world's most enduring enigmas.